So if you're looking, you're not cooking. Is there any truth to that? Let's dive in. So if I'm being honest, I actually don't know where this statement or myth or internet rumor or whatever you want to call it came from. It's hard to kind of pinpoint. Like anything on the internet, it seems to have been regurgitated over and over again, but I can't find the origins because it's partially kind of true. Kind of. We'll dive deeper into it, but I think it originated from low and slow and longer duration cooks, larger cuts of meat. And the reason I say that is because, I mean, we already know from face value, it doesn't apply with steaks. Cuts of steaks that are an inch, inch and a half thick, so forth. Because you can sear with the lid open and you can actually overcook your steak. So we already know that there's enough heat being generated when the lid's open, if you're looking, right? And you can still overshoot the internal temperatures. So I'm not going to test that. I'm going to skip that entirely. I already know it's false when it comes to steaks. We're going to try it on a larger cook, kind of simulating both somewhere in the middle of a steak and also low and slow or longer durations of cooks. And that's going to be with the tri-tip. A tri-tip's perfect because it's a larger cut of meat. You're going to see the impacts of, opening up the lid without needing to spend 12, 16 hours. But if you have any suggestions for a future video, if you want me to test out low and slow or something else, leave me a comment below. So let's dive a little bit deeper and look at the results of opening the lid and how it affects your cook. Okay, so these were the terms for the experiment. I opened up the lid for about 30 seconds. And I did this frequently throughout the cook. I wanted to test out how opening up the lid affects the cook in the beginning when you're trying to get up to temperature, as the food's cooking somewhere in the middle, and then at the end when it's about to be finished. Was there any significant impacts at all throughout those stages? The instrument that I used for this particular experiment was Combustion Inc.'s predictive thermometer. Because of its multiple sensors, I wanted to monitor the internal temperatures, the cooking temperatures of the tri-tip, along with the surface temperatures. Combustion Inc. is probably one of the best thermometers to do that on the market today. And then the ambient temperatures, which I looked at also the grill's, gauge, as well as Combustion Inc.'s thermometer, and kept an eye on that. But what's also nice about Combustion Inc. is I can export the data and then look at specific things and really hone in on key characteristics of the experiment. Off the bat, I found a couple of different interesting things, but let's look at initially when you're trying to get the grill up to temperature very early on, when you put the food in. So let's say, you got the grill exactly where you want it, you put your smoke in there, all that good stuff, and then you place the meat in there. How does looking affect cooking? And it was clear to me that it impacts the temperature stability. It was really hard to hit that temperature. You open up the grill for 30 seconds or so, you're looking at it, simulating, maybe taking pictures for Instagram or whatever. And when you close it back up, it takes a while for the temperatures to get back to a stable, steady state. So if you're shooting for 250 degrees or 350 degrees or 300, whatever, it's harder to achieve that, to get back up to those temperatures and then stay there. So I did this several times. You can see that in the graph, it drops and then it's not a sharp, increase back up. It's a gradual increase. And then you get to that temperature again. And then as you're chugging along that temperature, if you look again, let's say you're taking an Instagram photo or something, then it drops down again and it's harder to get back up. So you can see that the ambient temperature drops, which is expected, right? And you're opening up the lid, all the heat is escaping, and that makes a lot of sense. The surface temperature as well, that made a lot of sense. But the internal temperature for all three scenarios is still chugging along. And if you think about it, you may be thinking, well, there's proof right there that If you're looking, you're not cooking, it's false, video over. Not necessarily. We know that heat flows from hot to cold. So it makes perfect sense that your internal temperature will still be cooking. And that's because of two reasons. What I just said, heat flows from hot to cold, but also you're not going to like revert back, right? Your energy's not just going to like, I don't know, revert back. You're not going to uncook your meat, right? Or it's going to freeze, or I don't know, it's going to get cold. And the reason for that is, as long as there's a heat source, as long as the surface temperature of the food or the charcoal is generating hot temperatures, basically as long as there's heat, as long as there's enough heat to flow from hot to cold, you will get some sort of cooking, right? The internal temperatures will still cook, they'll still chug along. Now, granted, it's going to be very slow because it's not as efficient, but what I really liked about this particular experiment is you can see if the surface temperature is still hot, if it's still hotter than the internal, that surface temperature is getting its heat from the charcoal, right? So the charcoal heat is flowing to the surface temperature, hot to cold. And then that is also hotter than the internal. The surface temperature is hotter than the internal, and that's flowing from hot to cold. You're still going to get cooking. That was consistent throughout, in the beginning, in the middle, in the end. The internal temperatures are always chugging along, which makes perfect sense. But what's interesting is the rate that it's chugging along. It definitely slows down. You're not cooking as fast as you would be because you are losing efficiencies. Another crazy thing is, and this was very apparent later on, towards the end of the cook, I opened up the grill several times and those dips were very dramatic as the tri-tip was cooking, closer to the target temperature. And it kind of confused me in the beginning, but then I thought about it a little bit more, and that also made sense. Because you now have a greater internal temperature, right? It's a larger internal temperature, and you are removing a lot of heat. So to sustain that internal temperature, the energy that's required to sustain that cooking internal temperature, it's still great, right? Doesn't matter as much because you're still flowing from hot to cold, and as long as the other temperature, the surface temperature and the charcoal is generating heat higher than the internal temperature, you'll still cook. So the internal temperature was chugging along, that was fine. It was never dipping, you just saw a constant graph going up. Slow, but up. But the surface temperatures and the ambient temperature saw a large dip. And that was interesting. And what was more interesting was, not only was it a larger dip, but it was harder to get back. And I think it's just energy is being lost, and the energy required to maintain the internal temperature. There's a lot more energy that's being flown into the inside, right? So to maintain the cooking temperature. So it's a greater impact if you are lifting the lid and removing that energy, the cooking energy. It's just a greater impact. You're going to see it more. So what does all of this mean? It goes back to, if you're looking, you're not cooking. What does that mean exactly? What's the question asking? And if you just want to look at the context of that statement, the words, then it's false. Yes, it's a myth. You're still cooking. No question about that. But you're cooking at a much slower rate. It makes perfect sense logically if you just think about it. If you open up your oven or your gas grill or your charcoal grill or whatever, all that heat is escaping and you're no longer being efficient. But you are still cooking. So the statement is false. It's a myth. However, it's not a very smart thing to do. And if you're trying to do low and slow, and if you're trying to be consistent and get consistent results, it is impacting your results. A perfect example is, a tri-tip usually takes me anywhere between, an hour and 15 to an hour and a half, let's say, depending on the size, right? And I like doing low and slow and smoking it up and all that and taking my time. But that's me being efficient. This tri-tip took like almost 2 hours to complete. And that's because frequently opening up the grill. I mean, I was doing it like pretty frequent. I mean, you can see the dips in the chart, but I was doing it and then leaving it open for about 30 seconds, closing it up. It was just not very efficient at all. So when it came time to searing, you can see in the charts, that didn't matter at all. Opening up the lid and searing, open flames, all that stuff is still the same. There's just so much heat being generated. The surface temperature of the tri-tip is so much higher than the internal. You're still going to be cooking. You're still going to get searing, all that good stuff. And actually, if you look at the chart, I wanted to just sear the surface. I didn't want to cook the internal temperatures. One of the reasons why you open up the grill, right? So you're not baking the inside. And you can see that the surface temperature was searing beautifully. The internal temperature wasn't affected as much, but you still saw an increase in the internal temperature because there's still a lot more heat. Now, what I mean by an increase is you're cooking all along, but you see a slighter rate of change, an increase of rate in the internal temperature, very, very slightly. You have to zoom in on the graph because it's just greater compared to what was happening before. The temperatures on the surface, the charcoal, all that, you're closer to the heat source, was just greater than before. So, in conclusion, it's false. You're still cooking. But I think what the statement was trying to say, and I think it probably was lost in translation over the years, was that you're not very efficient if you're looking. You're not cooking efficiently. I think that's what they're trying to say. You're still cooking, but you're not cooking very smart. That's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video informative, and if you did, please consider subscribing and joining our channel membership so we can continue making videos like this one. Take care, everybody.